Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I'm going to be doing a review of The Darkness That Comes Before by R Scott Bakker. So I decided to pick up this book this year because I'd heard quite a lot of people raving about it. Specifically Mark from the Slowly Read channel put it on my radar, and then in his Discord, which I will link down below, a lot of the folks in there are like die-hard fans of this world that Bakker has built. And so those guys, I trust their opinions, and, I've really been getting into grim dark and darker fantasy over the past 6 to 9 months, I would say in particular. And I thought, given that this is one of the most kind of quintessential grim dark books series, I thought, I got to do it. I got to pick it up and I've got to commit to it and I'm going to make it happen. In the month of February, I picked up the first book, The Darkness That Comes Before. So the way that Bakker has set up the world, there is an initial trilogy, which is the Prince of Nothing trilogy, and then there is a second trilogy, which is the Aspect Emperor trilogy. So there are 6 books in total. I have no idea if he's planning to write more. I haven't really done too much reading about the existing books and the future books because I kind of want to take each book as I take it. I don't want to learn too much about what to expect because I feel like this is one of those series that is better enjoyed when you don't know that much about it going into it. And that's what I did with this book. In this book, we are following a cast of characters as they are going through their own individual journeys in this really unforgiving world that Bakker has created. It is essentially laying down the foundations, I think, for the following books where we are essentially leading up to this holy war. And beyond that, I'm not really going to say too much because this book is one of those books that it's incredibly complex. There's a lot going on. At the same time, it doesn't necessarily feel like lots is happening, if that makes sense. Kind of reminds me of Parker in that way, where there's actually a lot happening under the surface, but it's not spelt out to the reader, which I actually really enjoy. I really like writing when it's a little bit more subtle and the reader has to kind of work hard for it a little bit because it makes the overall experience more enjoyable, in my opinion. The backdrop, at least in the first part of the book, is that we are getting this picture of all of these different races, these different religions, these different factions, almost different magical orders as well. So we are really getting the lay of the land. There is a lot to learn. There's lots of names and there's lots of places. There is a glossary in the book, but it can be a little bit overwhelming, especially if you are somebody like me who has never read a book like this before. Apparently a lot of my friends who have read Malazan prior to reading the Prince of Nothing trilogy found it a lot easier because from what I understand, Malazan has a lot of names, has a lot of places, a lot of dates. If you are used to it through reading Malazan and maybe other similar authors to Erickson, then I have a feeling you're probably going to find this a little bit easier to read than, say, somebody who has never read it before, like myself. So there's a little bit of context on the story and essentially kind of what to expect. It's really key to mention that this is really just laying down the foundations for this, mammoth world that Bakker has created. I haven't started the second book at the time of the recording of this video, though by the time that this is out, I'll probably be in the process of reading it, or I may have even finished it, we'll see. Even though the story is fairly contained in book 1, as in that there isn't, like a huge cliffhanger, it's pretty clear where the story is going to be going in book 2. So without further ado, I'm now going to jump into my review. There's a lot to talk about. I'm going to try and keep this review fairly succinct, but I don't know if that's going to happen because there's a lot to talk about. So let's talk about, obviously, the things that I liked. So the things that I really loved is the prose. The prose is absolutely stunning. There is a very poetic, almost lyrical way that Bakker writes. I think he does a really good job of not making it feel like flowery. There's always the risk that when you read this type of writing, it feels just very like nonsensical and it doesn't really make sense and it doesn't really have a place. I think in this circumstance, it actually works really well. It counteracts the fact that the book is quite dense in places, but I think overall, I really liked the way that he writes. I think the way that he writes just flows really nicely, and it never felt like he was doing it just for the sake of doing it, which I really appreciate as a reader. The second thing that I really enjoyed related to the writing is the dialogue. I think the dialogue is very minimalistic in a sense. I feel like every single word that is written on the page is there for a reason. I don't think Bakker is the type of writer that wastes words. Thinking about Robert Jordan and, some of the other authors that I've read recently, especially him, where it just sometimes feels like you could probably skip a chapter and you probably wouldn't have missed much. But this is the sort of book where every word matters, every interaction, every conversation matters, and you feel like it holds weight. And that builds tension. It builds a really great atmosphere for the reader. I constantly felt like I was on the edge of my seat, even though there isn't tons happening. It's just people talking and it's people trying to understand what is going on themselves. We are observing that, obviously, from a third-party perspective, but it never felt boring because the dialogue and the impact of what was being said by the characters mattered. And I love that. I really love when words matter. Sometimes, I know that sounds really funny, we're all readers, obviously words matter, but I do feel like sometimes authors can just be very like word vomity in the way that they write, and I hate that, I detest that. But Bakker doesn't do that, in my opinion. I think he's very selective in what he writes, and I really appreciate it. The next thing that I really enjoyed is the character work. The character work is really great. The thing I will mention is that the characters, none of them are particularly likable. They're all very morally grey. Some of them are even just bad people. But we have a really great array of people that we follow that, you know, you're getting their different perspectives of the events that are happening in the story. And it gives you this kind of 360 view of the world, which I really enjoy. So this isn't going to be spoilers. If you haven't read it, these names are just not going to mean anything to you. But the characters that I really liked the most, there were 4 or 5 characters that I really enjoyed. The first one is Akamian. I really liked Akamian's perspective. I think the thing about Akamian that I really enjoy is that he's this very, you know, clearly intelligent character, but he has this insane self-doubt with a lot of what he does. And that's because of things that have happened prior to the events of the book. We start to learn about what some of those are. He second guesses himself multiple times throughout the story, and you just kind of want him to commit, because from the perspective of the reader, it seems like he's actually onto something. And I really like that about Akamian, because he's clearly thinking about things in a very different way to some of the other characters. Obviously, he comes from a very different background. But the thing I like about Akamian the most is that he's also an outcast. He's a sorcerer, which in this world, sorcery is perceived as an incredibly negative thing in general. And because of that, he is constantly on the lookout for how he is going to be treated and how he is going to be perceived by the other characters in this world. And because you're getting his inner thoughts, it just provides this really interesting insight into what it feels to be different and what it feels to be somebody who is considered an outsider, which I really like. I don't know if Bakker was necessarily trying to make that point, but it made that point for me. And I completely empathized with Akamian. He's one of those people that he should be listened to, but for reasons, people don't necessarily listen to him all of the time because of things that have happened in the past, which isn't necessarily fair, but there we have it. The second character that I really liked is Esmenet. I really enjoyed Esmenet's relationship with Akamian. Their interactions were actually some of my favorite at the start of the book. I really like that first chapter where we get a conversation between the two of them. Esmenet is essentially a prostitute. Women in this world are treated incredibly poorly, but the thing that I will say is that everybody is treated incredibly poorly. I had heard a lot of comments prior to me reading this book that, you know, sometimes people DNF'd it or they didn't even want to read the book because of the treatment of women in the story. But in my opinion, this world is equally unforgiving to women as it is to anybody else in this world. Nobody is safe. Women, children, men, old, young, doesn't matter. Nobody is safe. And that's what I like about this world, is that it treats everybody, almost everybody, as an equal. And that's very rare in fantasy. We almost always have hierarchy. We almost always have rich, poor. And yes, we do have those dichotomies as well. But the world is so grim that it affects everybody in one way or another, regardless of who they are and where they are. And so Esmenet's perspective is really interesting because she is one of 2 female characters that we follow. And she's clearly very smart. She is very invested in the events that are happening in the book. And I'm just really curious to see whether she really steps up in book 2. I'm really hoping that she does, but you know, knowing what I've heard, I don't know if that's necessarily going to be the case, which I think might be a little bit of a missed opportunity. But I'm not gonna jump to conclusions. But I really liked her perspective. I think she provides a really refreshing insight into this world from a female perspective. And I think if you're going into this expecting a book that is really going to be empowering women, don't expect that. But she has power in other ways, which is, again, something that I really appreciated. The other characters that I really enjoyed that I'm just going to very quickly mention is Confus. Confus is great. Confus is, I actually think, is probably my favorite character. He's your typical kind of, you know, warrior, bit of a celebrity. Everybody really respects him. Well, most people really respect him. He's loved by his people, and he is a symbol more than he is anything else. He's smart and he's very capable, and I really do like those characters. I really liked being in his head because you can just tell that he's a lot more politically adept than maybe people give him credit for. And I love characters like that. Even though he's clearly this figurehead and this symbol, people still continue to underestimate him, which is probably going to work out bad for them. The next character that I really liked is Anasarimba Kellis. Kellis is somebody that we get a lot of exposure to in the latter half of the book. He's this kind of mysterious figure. He has a very important role to play in the series, knowing what we know of him in book one. By the end of book one, he's got this very calming, almost kind of mystical demeanor with the other characters, and they don't really know what to make of him. And to be honest with you, as the reader, I didn't really know what to make of him, and I think Bakker was probably doing that on purpose. I have a feeling that he's probably going to be pulling a lot of the puppet strings later on. He's going to be the master puppeteer. But I really enjoyed his interactions with a lot of the characters, especially with Naya. The dialogue between the two of them was fascinating. Last but not least, I'm going to mention Proyas. I really like Proyas, mainly because I love the way that he contrasts with Confus. I have a feeling that these two are going to start batting heads quite a bit in The Warrior Prophet and in The Thousandfold Thought, and I'm really looking forward to it. They're both very good at what they do, and when you put two very strong-minded, very intelligent people together, without a doubt, you're going to get some friction. I guess the key thing I'll mention about Proyas is that he is more of a religious figure. He's the opposite of Confus. Confus, he's a military figure, a warrior, whereas Proyas is much more on the other side of that spectrum. So seeing two people who are very similar but also operate in very different worlds was fascinating, and I really liked that difference between the two of them. Next, I spent a lot more time on characters than I thought I was going to, but there we go. The next thing that I really loved, and maybe I should have mentioned this first, but it is what it is the overall setting. As I mentioned before, this world is equally unforgivable for everybody, regardless of your stature, your gender, your age, your race. It's just unfair on everyone in some way, shape or form. I think the tone that Bakker is able to create, it's not something that I've really read before. I mean, I've read a fair amount of darker fantasy over the past, couple of months, but I've never read it in this way, and I have a feeling that Malazan is probably going to be quite similar, maybe even a step up from what I understand. But I do really like the overall tone of the book. It just feels like a world when happiness can't thrive. It feels like a world where nothing good can come out of it. It feels like a world where people have to make decisions that are perhaps not great decisions or bad decisions, but because of the world and what is at stake, they have to make them. And so they are forced into making those decisions. And I love that. And I think that's also relevant to some of the broader philosophy that Bakker brings into his books, which I will come on to in a second. You really feel that the stakes are high and that any moment something can happen and it's going to completely impact the overarching world, which again, I really like it when stakes are high, tensions are running high. It creates that sense of urgency, which I really enjoy. Moving on to the next thing that I really like. So there's a couple of things that I really enjoyed more on the philosophy side. So one of the things that I didn't really expect, I was aware of it, but I didn't really expect it because obviously I never read this book before. But one thing that I really enjoyed was the philosophy and the religious aspects of this book. This book is one of those books that I would have really loved to have studied when I read philosophy at university, because I feel like you can impact so much. And I think what I might end up doing is once I finish this first trilogy, I'll actually do a video just on the philosophy in this story, because there's a lot. And I'm not going to go into too much detail because you could do a whole video on that on its own, like I said. I really liked how Bakker integrates it into the story without it feeling like you're reading a really dense philosophy book. That being said, I am somebody who read philosophy at university. Philosophy is something that I read still today, and I read plenty of it. So for me, when I read philosophy, it's probably very different to somebody who hasn't read that much philosophy or studied it in a formal capacity. And so for me, it never felt that dense, but I know for other people, it can completely go over their head, which is totally fine. It really depends on what you're used to. So just be aware of that going into this. If you're expecting something that is an easy read, I don't think these books are an easy read. Like, I think you really have to be in the right headspace. I think you really have to focus and pay attention to what is going on. And that is a potential downside for certain readers, I think. But anyway, back on the topic of philosophy and religion, I think Bakker was heavily influenced by a number of religions in, obviously our present world. We have the Inrithi, and I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, any Bakker fans, I think he was heavily influenced by Christianity and Hinduism. And then I think with the Fanim, he was heavily influenced by Islam. There are definitely commonalities between both of these groups of people. As an example, one of the things that he mentions that really connected the dots for me is that not only do the Fanim believe in one God, but they also believe in not showing depictions of God. And with the Inrithi, there is talk about deities, which kind of made me think about Hinduism, but there are some aspects of Christianity in there as well. I think this combination of having these religions that we're very aware of in our own society, and then also setting it up in the way that he sets it up as this kind of holy war, really reminded me of the Crusades. From what I understand, he was quite heavily influenced by the Crusades, and you can definitely see that in the story, and I loved it. I went through this phase in my early 20s where I was fascinated by the Crusades. I bought a lot of those. I don't know if any of you guys have done this yourself, but like the really dense old history books that are about the Crusades and about ancient Greece and about, any period of history, really. I bought a bunch of those and I read those from like really old school British authors, and I loved it. It was great. I learned a lot from it, obviously, but it felt familiar to me. When I was reading it, it felt familiar to me. There were aspects that I could pull from our own history that kind of paralleled what Bakker is putting into this book, or at least setting the scene for the later book. So I really enjoyed that. I think when it comes to philosophy, I'm going to try and not talk too much about this because, like I said, I really want to do a dedicated video on it and I want to keep this review fairly contained. But I think the thing that I really liked is the fact that there are a couple of different concepts that run throughout this book. Determinism, cause and effect, those are just a couple. I really like that you can clearly see some influences from Nietzsche, Machiavelli, Kant even. And these are all people that are reasonably familiar to me. So it was just really nice to actually read a fantasy book that is influenced heavily by a lot of the people that I studied and I read and I continue to read today. It never felt like I was reading Kant. It never felt like I was reading Nietzsche. It flowed really well. And if you are somebody who is interested in any of those philosophers or any of those concepts that I mentioned, then you should definitely pick up this book because it is a very core tenet of the way that he writes. And I think it's just executed overall really, really well. When it comes to the core themes of this book, I think there are two. I think one, which is, I don't think we necessarily know the direction that this is going to go in. And this is that whole idea of the triumph of good over evil. We don't really know who's good and evil at this point in time, in my opinion. I think I have a sense, but I will not be surprised if Bakker completely upends that by the end of the trilogy, and I'm rooting for people that I didn't necessarily think I was going to be rooting for. I think the other core theme of this book, if I was going to boil it down to 1 to 2 themes, is the idea of predetermination, of how we as individuals have our lives mapped out for us, but then the ability to actually overcome that and self-actualize and change things in a way that isn't necessarily predetermined naturally. I think this whole idea of predeterminism, self-actualization is really interesting. And I'm really curious to see how it evolves in the next 2 books and then obviously into the Aspect Emperor series as well. So that's my sense on the more thematic work. The last thing that I'm going to mention is the fact that I really like this tension between sorcery and religion that we have. We've seen throughout history that this whole idea of like sorcery and magic has always been something to be feared. And I think that is perfectly realized in this world. I think a lot of modern fantasy books generally show magic, not necessarily in a positive or a negative light, but it's just a fact of life. And we just accept it as the reader, and the characters in the books just accept it. But in this world, magic is very real, but people don't accept it. And I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed that magic is seen in a very negative way from pretty much the majority of the characters. And I thought it was a really refreshing take on how magic can be perceived in a society. I know that sounds kind of basic, but I just don't feel like that's done a lot in fantasy. and I really appreciated it. The last thing I'm going to do on this review before I read out a couple of quotes is I'm just going to mention what people might not like about it. And I think the number one thing is the overall tone of the book. If you don't like darkness in your book at all, do not read this book. There are trigger warnings for everything: swearing, violence, mistreatment of women, mistreatment of everybody, to be honest with you. It's just the overall world is extremely, it's just, like I said, it's extremely hopeless. There's very little hope in this world, very little, talk of happiness. And we get these little quiet moments throughout the book where characters have moments of interactions where you're like, oh, maybe there's a bit of hope, and then that completely dissipates in the next chapter. So definitely if you're not in the mood for that, and if that's not your cup of tea, totally get it. I would definitely keep it away from it. My overall rating for this book was 4.5 stars. The reason why I didn't give it 5 stars is because it took me a while to really get into the flow. I think it took me like a lot longer than, say, the average book that I read to really get into it. And that was just because of the names, the dates, well, not really dates, but the names and the places. It's just a lot. It's a lot for somebody who's never read Malazan, has never read this type of world building before. And while I can appreciate the effort that went into it, it's not going to be for everybody, and it was not for me at the start. But now I'm used to it, and I feel like it's kind of made me used to his writing, which is good. But that was the main thing that stopped me from giving it a 5. That being said, I would not be surprised if I end up giving the rating a higher rating after I've finished books 2 and 3. I feel like this is one of those books where it's incredibly foundational to the rest of the series. I think Bakker has probably set certain things in motion in book 1 that I haven't even really noticed yet, and I will notice that when I get to books 2 and 3. It kind of reminds me of Daniel Abraham a little bit with LPQ, and I have a feeling that I will end up bumping up this book once I finish the overall trilogy. So without further ado, I'm going to just read a couple of quotes, because I think sometimes it's good to give a flavour of the overall feel of the world, and sometimes people don't necessarily own the book, or they don't have easy access to seeing the text or whatever. So I thought I would read a couple, and none of these are spoilers. They are just things that I really liked, and I think there's loads. I actually don't normally tab, but I tab the hell out of this book. So first quote: "No soul moves alone through the world, Lewith. Our every thought stems from the thoughts of others. Our every word is but a repetition of words spoken before. Every time we listen, we allow the movements of another soul to carry our own." That's one. The next one, and that gives you an idea of some of the philosophy in this book. The next one is this one: "To be ignorant and to be deceived are two different things. To be ignorant is to be a slave of the world. To be deceived is to be the slave of another man. The question will always be, why, when all men are ignorant and therefore already slaves, does this latter slavery sting us so?" Oh man, that quote has stuck with me so much. So much. Such a good quote. All right, next one. I'll do maybe, I've got loads. I'm going to do maybe 2 or 3 more. We'll do 2 more. Otherwise, I'm going to be just reading the whole book at this point. "So changed. What's happened to him?" But even as he asked this, Achamian recognized the answer. Proyas suffered, as all men of high purpose must. The endless exchange of principles for advantages. No triumph without remorse. No respite without siege. Compromise after anxious compromise, until one's entire life felt a defeat. So good. Oh, that quote is so good. And then the last one that I will pick, I really like this quote. This is a really great quote. All right, I'm going to go for it. "You are all staggering drunks to me. Boys who would play at war when you should kennel with your mothers. You know nothing of war. War is dark, black as pitch. It is not a god. It does not laugh or weep. It rewards neither skill nor daring. It is not a trial of souls nor the measure of wills. Even less is it a tool, a means to some womanish end. It is merely the place where the iron bones of the earth meet the hollow bones of men and break them." And that is actually a really great way to summarize the tone of this book. That last quote is just, that gives you a flavor of how like dark this world is. The entire book is like that. So if you didn't like the sound of that, then I just strongly would not recommend it. But there we go. That's my review. I definitely think this is a way longer review than I think this is the longest review that I've ever done, but I wanted to give a somewhat more detailed analysis of what I thought about the book. As you can tell, I really enjoyed it. I really loved it. I will be picking up The Warrior Prophet very soon. By the time this video comes out, I will probably already be reading it, maybe even have finished it. Let me know if you've read it. I know there are a couple of folks that have been asking me when I will be putting this review out, so here you go. I'm very curious to hear, you know, what you thought about the writing, the setting, the characters, and then, you know, we can definitely have a conversation about the philosophy as well. But I will be doing a dedicated video on that because that deserves much more time and attention that I can currently give it. And I think it would be better to do that at the end of the trilogy. So let's take the conversation down below. Definitely let me know what you think. Be careful of spoilers as always. And I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and give us a subscribe if you're not already. Take care, stay safe, and I will speak to you soon. Bye.